I am Emily Carter, the eldest daughter of the Carter family, living in what most would call a comfortable life in the suburbs of Dallas. From the outside, our house looks picture perfect. A neatly trimmed lawn, smiling family photos on the walls, and the image of stability that neighbors envy. My father, Richard Carter, is respected in business. My mother, Susan, is admired for her charm, and my younger brother, Jake, has always been treated as the golden child. To anyone else, we were the definition of the all-American family. But behind those closed doors, I lived a different reality. Jake's needs, his victories, even his mistakes were celebrated, forgiven, and polished into stories of pride. Mine? Overlooked, dismissed, or worse, ridiculed. I was always in his shadow, treated like an accessory to the family's image rather than a member of it. I learned early on that my voice carried no weight, that my presence was more tolerated than valued. People often told me I was lucky to grow up with everything I could want. They didn't realize that what I lacked couldn't be bought or faked. Respect, love, and recognition. Deep down, I knew I wasn't seen as a real person at all. The fluorescent light in the clinic hummed like a distant refrigerator, steady and indifferent, and I remember the way the room smelled of antiseptic and paper. I sat on the plastic chair by the window, knees tucked against my chest, watching the small world of my family move in front of me as if I weren't part of it. The doctor spoke in that calm, procedural tone. "We'll need a blood sample." And it should have been an ordinary, forgettable thing. Instead, it became the moment everything that had been simmering inside me was poured out as contempt, a sentence that cleaved my life into before and after. My mother's laugh cut the air, sharp and careless. She leaned forward with that smile that had always been performative, like a woman practicing a script. "Take Emily's," she said, loud enough for the nurse to look up. "She's just extra storage anyway." It landed in the room like a thrown stone. Jake snickered, embarrassed and thrilled at once. My father's head tilted slightly. He didn't defend me. He merely nodded as if approving a clever joke. The nurse's eyes flicked between us, awkward and small. The doctor, clipboard in hand, paused and then continued because he had to. Because rules and charts must be followed even when people act shamefully. For a second, I didn't know how to breathe. The words stretched in the sterile air, echoing off linoleum and glass. Storage. The repetition in their voices made it a kind of chant, a private brand made public. It had always been their private joke, an inside humiliation I pretended not to hear. Little barbs at the dinner table, a tossed-off remark when they wanted compliance. But here, in the light of a clinic with strangers present, it was a declaration. My mother had announced to the world that I belonged to a lower category of person, useful only as a source of parts, a reserve to be tapped. I felt my identity compress, as if someone had pressed my name into a mold and left only the hollow form. When they laughed, the sound registered somewhere far, like an ocean wave I could see but not touch. Jake's mirth turned quick and ugly, his smallness disguised as cruelty. My father's quiet agreement felt like a slow, patient betrayal. I remember tasting metal. The metallic tang of fear or blood, I couldn't tell, and biting my lip until it bled to anchor myself in the hurt. The doctor murmured something bureaucratic about samples and accuracy, and the nurse moved to collect the blood, efficient and professional. Their practicalities were a wall between me and the humiliation, but they couldn't erase it. Afterward, as my mother fussed over Evan with exaggerated tenderness, as if to prove her point about who deserved care, the room seemed to tilt. I went home weightless and heavy at once, carrying an invisible brand that pulsed under my skin. In the weeks that followed, their words became ritual. Storage landed on the fridge next to shopping lists. Post-it notes scrawled in my mother's sharp hand reminded me not to touch certain foods. Storage, don't eat the good stuff. And my father would toss his boots at me as if I were a doormat whose only job was to absorb the debris of his day. Jake delighted in the nickname, using it like a club, testing the edges of my silence. He'd call his friends and put the phone on speaker, chuckling as he reported that they had a storage unit who could do their chores. The cruel performances were so consistent that they blurred into the wallpaper of my life. There was a new cadence to family life. A joke, a laugh, a spit of derision, followed by my silence. At first, the silence felt like capitulation. There were nights when I stood at the sink, dishwater rising around my hands, and thought, maybe they're right. Maybe I don't matter. The pressure in my chest was almost physical. My ribs felt too small for breath. I replayed the clinic moment and other small slights. My mother's sighs, my father's dismissive gestures, neighbors' polite but pitying smiles, and each one became another weight pressing on me. I imagined myself diminished to something hollow, a vessel to be filled and emptied by others. The thought alone was suffocating. I would catch my reflection in the microwave door and not recognize the eyes looking back. Those eyes had learned to shrink in the presence of other people's esteem. But silence transformed. It was not just absence of sound. It became a method, a strategy. I began to listen not merely to their words, but to their patterns. Where before I had recoiled, now I observed. I learned their rhythms, the small tells that accompanied dishonesty, the places where carelessness bled into cruelty. My father's overconfidence at company dinners, my mother's compulsive need to control the image they presented, Jake's frantic pursuit of approval at the expense of decency. These were not random traits, but threads I could follow. I memorized conversations I had once wanted to forget. I kept mental notes of dates, of expenses, of the times my father left his briefcase unlocked. I learned where my mother hid receipts and which folders on the family computer she never bothered to password protect. The transition from a body that shrank to one that cataloged was subtle, like a tide slowly changing. I started to carry a small notebook in my sweater pocket, more out of habit than intention at first. Little things I'd scribble, what someone said at dinner, a peculiar text message previewed on a phone, an overheard confession, accumulated into a private archive. I took photographs of moments that revealed cracks in their performance, a screenshot of Jake's cruel messages to a classmate, a snapshot of my mother's quick, panicked messages to a man whose name she claimed was business, a receipt that didn't add up. I was careful. I recorded these things in ways that wouldn't be obvious. I memorized bank account numbers I glimpsed, the tone of voice my father used when he lied, the eyebrow that lifted when my mother said something untrue. My silence was no longer a surrender. It was a vault. This quiet memorizing had an unexpected effect. It gave me distance. When my mother used the word storage flippantly at the breakfast table, I felt the old flash of pain, but also a kind of calm calculation. I began to parse the laughter around me, to analyze who followed with an apology and who did not, who laughed out of habit and who laughed with malice. I kept watching Jake when he made his jokes, waiting for the micro-expressions that betrayed insecurity under the bravado. When my father boasted to friends about a deal that smelled suspicious, I filed away names and figures. The shame that once flooded me was tempered by an emerging purpose. The humiliation that felt like a wound began to map out a route. If they could weaponize words, I could collect them as evidence. People who are ignored learn to become invisible in plain sight. I moved through the house like a shadow, but with heightened senses. Seeing contradictions, hearing the lies before the laughter smoothed them over. Friends of my parents began to drop by. I listened to their compliments and to the small reveals in their offhand comments. I learned which ones could be trusted to cringe when the truth came out and which would avert their eyes to protect the facade. The more I gathered, the less powerless I felt. It was a slow reclamation of agency. Through quiet accumulation, I was building a case not only against the insult itself, but against the system of denials and reputations that upheld it. Still, there were nights when the loneliness returned in waves. I would sit in my room and let the silence press around me like a physical thing, feeling small and abandoned. Tears came sometimes, hot and private, and I let them fall. But even those nights were different. There was an undercurrent of resolve now, the sense that the silence had a point. I no longer trembled from fear alone. I was steadying myself for a future moment when what I'd stored would have to be opened. The nickname they thrust at me would no longer be a brand. It would be a ledger. My silence had a purpose. I would keep listening, keep saving, until the right moment arrived. One night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and said aloud what I had been thinking in secret for months. If I am a storage, then I will store everything that matters about them. The sentence felt like a promise, COO. It turned the dull ache in my chest into something with an edge, a plan. I started small because small things were safer. I left my phone recording on the kitchen counter while my mother unloaded her nightly performance, the laugh, the toss of a remark about ungrateful extras. I learned how to set the phone so it wouldn't blink or vibrate if she walked by. I learned where the camera angle would capture her mouth without looking staged. The first recordings were messy, breathy, half-formed, but they were real. I became tidy with evidence. I took photographs on the pretense of sending messages to friends, quick snaps of receipts, of screen previews, of a browser tab my father had left open. I screenshot the texts that flashed on my mother's phone when she thought no one was watching. Messages that read like a story I had never wanted to hear. I used old passwords she loved, the ones that were all but invitations because she never believed anything in this house should be guarded against family. My father was complacent at the office. He left spreadsheets open on a laptop that synchronized quietly to a cloud I could access when I sat in the den with a coffee and a solid face. There are ways people forget their privacy when they believe their status protects them. I learned those ways. I also became deliberate in how I cataloged. There was a rhythm to it: record, label, hide. I numbered audio files by date and time, noting in a margin what the insult had been or what lie had been told. I made copies and stored them in unexpected places. An old USB drive in the bottom of a winter boot in the closet they never opened in summer. A password-protected folder under a throwaway folder name on the family laptop. An email draft saved but never sent from an account they assumed dead. I printed things and hid physical copies inside books on the highest shelf in my room where dust gathered and their hands seldom reached. Each piece of evidence felt like another brick being laid in a wall that would one day protect me. There were risks. I almost got caught more than once. Once my mother rifled through my bag looking for a missing lipstick and paused, squinting at a folded note that peered out. She laughed it off, asking if I'd been keeping a diary, and I smiled and said yes, because confession would have been the end of what I was building. When Jake came into my room one afternoon to borrow headphones, I kept my hands in my lap and let him touch my desk while my heart hammered in my throat. I learned to be casual in the presence of suspicion, to move with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide while holding the weightiest secrets in my pockets. As I collected, I also began to map consequences. I imagined, sometimes cruelly, what would happen if the ledger of everything I had stored went public. The looks of colleagues when my father's invoices didn't add up. The small, precise pause in a neighbor's smile when they realized their friend had been unfaithful. The way a school would handle video proof of a student who tormented another. I was not happy at the thought of their ruin. I was calculating. If I had been reduced to a thing, then exposing the truth would show how fragile the things they prized actually were. The plan that took root was not dramatic. It didn't involve revenge for revenge's sake. It was a quiet, surgical release at the right time and place, where the performance of the family, its public face, would be most violently contradicted by the truth. I watched calendars and invitations, the rhythms of social obligations. The opportunity presented itself in the shape of an evening that promised bodies, a dinner to celebrate my father's promotion, a crowd of colleagues and neighbors who would clap and drink and tell stories about how admirable the Carters were. It was exactly the sort of stage they relished, a place where the mask was polished to high shine. I knew they would behave as if nothing was wrong. They would double down on the pretense so hard that their own voices would be impossible to deny. On the night of the party, I dressed in something deliberately forgettable, a dress that was neutral in color and plain in cut. I did not want to be the center of attention. I wanted the attention to fall on them, so that when the sound of truth came, it would cut through the applause. My hands were steady because I had to be steady. Adrenaline was a tool I permitted myself to use precisely. I had copies of the files in 3 places: a thumb drive in my pocket, an email queued to send, and my phone set to play the most damning audio on loop with a volume that would not be easily muted. I kept my face composed as laughter bubbled around me, as people told flattering stories about my father and toasted his name. Then it happened. Someone, one of my father's colleagues, made a joke about family, about privilege, and my mother's laugh rose immediately, full and bright. She chose that moment, the one that made them all look up and lean into the joke, to make the same old crack she always did, the line that had once been private. "Oh, Emily, take her blood, she's just extra storage," she said, motioning with the kind of theatricality she thought charming. A ripple of polite laughter followed, hollow and easy, until I stepped forward. I set my phone on the buffet table and hit play. The first thing that came through was my mother's voice, sharp and casual, the exact cadence that had cut through a clinic months before. Then others. Jake's small, gleeful snicker. My father's quiet assent. The noise in the room dropped away as if someone had pressed their hands to the room's throat. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The clink of glasses seemed to freeze. Faces, the ones that had smiled at every holiday, went pale. My mother's mouth shaped with a sound I had never heard before. Shock, then anger, then fear. People looked at each other, then at me, then back at the source of their discomfort. I didn't flinch as I followed the audio with the documents. I walked the room with printed pages held at my side, handing them to a neighbor, a friend of the company, a woman who ran the charity my mother volunteered for. I didn't need to shout. The prints spoke. The ledger lines were clear, and so were the dates. Text messages were shown on a screen for everyone to read. I played the video of Jake laughing as he shoved another boy in the school hallway, the angle shaky but unmistakable. Eyes that had admired my family now dropped to the floor with disgust. I watched alliances dissolve like sugar in hot water. The humiliation they had dished out to me returned to them in a different form, public, articulate, and impossible to rewrite. My father's colleagues exchanged looks heavy with calculation. Some rose and left quietly, unwilling to be associated with scandal. My mother's voluntary world narrowed as people she thought would defend her made polite excuses and moved away. Jake's friends tried to smirk and laugh it off, but the video had made his cruelty plain. In the space of a single evening, the house of polished veneers my parents had maintained for decades revealed the rot beneath. I felt no soaring triumph. There was a sharp release, yes, like unclamping a hand from around my throat. But there was also a hollow where something had been. For months, that hollowness had been filled with quiet rage and plans. Now it was something else. Relief and a strange, cautious grief for what had to be broken before I could walk free. People muttered. Someone called for calm. My mother's voice, once the loudest in the room, reduced to small sounds as she tried to get control of herself. They had mocked me for being extra. That night, everything they counted as their superiority, the money, the image, the stories, fell away like a stage set after the curtain goes down. I stood in what was left, not triumphant, but finally present. When the storm finally passed, my father was under investigation and stripped of his position. My mother's friends no longer answered her calls. The woman who once thrived on attention was left to face silence. Jake, who had laughed the loudest at my pain, was suspended from school and ridiculed across social media. The mask of our perfect family had cracked beyond repair. As for me, I packed a single suitcase and walked away from the house that had never felt like home. My steps were steady, my chest lighter than it had ever been. I did not savor their downfall. It wasn't revenge that filled me with satisfaction. It was freedom. For the first time, I was no longer the shadow, no longer the storage unit they mocked me as. I carried no bitterness, only clarity. They had written me off as silent, but silence had been my sharpest weapon. Now, it was my shield and my strength. I realized something profound as I closed that chapter of my life. Silence does not mean weakness. Sometimes silence is the sharpest blade, cutting deeper than any scream could. And I had finally used it to carve out my own place in the world.